The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun began its descent behind the dense canopy of trees surrounding the secluded cabin. Matthew Williams stood motionless on the balcony, staring out at the vast expanse of the Smoky Mountains. The crisp evening air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, swirling around the chaos of the last 24 hours. He was alone in the moment but not truly alone. Isaac was gone and Matthew had killed him. The luxurious cabin, tucked away from the rest of the world, had been their sanctuary. Isaac had always wanted a place where they could escape, their little secret, away from the prying eyes of the small town they both had been trapped in. For months they had planned the trip, imagining their life together after marriage. Isaac had smiled so brightly on their wedding day, his eyes full of hope. And for the briefest moment, Matthew had shared that same hope. But now that hope was buried, and the silence that surrounded him was deafening. Matthew couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but it had been coming for weeks, maybe months. Isaac had become distant in the days leading up to the honeymoon, the smiles becoming more forced, the laughter hollow. Matthew had tried to ignore the signs, but deep down he felt the shift in their relationship, the same shift he had tried to bury inside for years. His love for Isaac had always felt like a secret burden, but it had been the only thing that made sense in his chaotic world. No one had known. No one could know. The town's expectations of him as the pastor's son made it impossible to be himself. And Isaac, sweet Isaac, was just as trapped as he was. But something had snapped the night before, the night that would change everything. They had been sitting on the porch enjoying a drink, watching the stars. The conversation had started innocently enough. Isaac had asked about their future. He had wanted to know if Matthew was ready to make their relationship public, to stop hiding it from the world. He had begged Matthew to come clean to his father, to stop pretending. The pressure in Matthew's chest had intensified. His mind raced with the potential fallout. The guilt of hiding such a fundamental part of his life, the shame of keeping a secret so close to his heart, it had all come crashing down on him. His father, his mother, the church, they would never accept him for what he was, for who he loved. The tension between them had grown palpable. Isaac had pressed him harder, his voice rising, pleading with Matthew to choose a life without hiding. But Matthew couldn't. Not in that small town where people like him were nothing but whispers behind closed doors. He couldn't risk everything, his reputation, his family's reputation, the life he had always known, for love. It was then that Matthew's emotions spiraled into a darkness he had never known. His fist had collided with Isaac's face before he even realized it. The shock on Isaac's face had paralyzed him, but only for a moment. Isaac had tried to step back, raising his hands in defense, but Matthew's anger, his fear, everything that had been building inside him for so long erupted. The confrontation escalated quickly, far too quickly. Words turned to physical violence. Matthew wasn't sure what happened next, it was all a blur. In a moment of blind rage, he had shoved Isaac against the railing of the balcony, knocking him over the edge. Isaac had hit the wooden floor below with a sickening thud. But that wasn't enough. No, Matthew wasn't finished. The guilt, the self-loathing, the overwhelming fear, it drove him to do something even worse. Something that he couldn't undo. He'd grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal sculpture, and struck Isaac again and again, until Isaac's body went limp. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't something Matthew had planned. It was a moment of violence, an explosion of emotion he had never expected to feel. And now Isaac was gone. Dead. Standing at the edge of the balcony, Matthew tried to replay the events in his mind, but it all felt like a twisted dream. Isaac's face, contorted in pain, fear, disbelief, haunted him. How could he have done it? How could he have destroyed the only person who ever made him feel seen? The person who loved him without judgment? He had promised Isaac that they would figure it out, that they could be together. But the truth was, Matthew had never been ready to face the world as it was. His family, the town, his future, none of it had prepared him for a love like this. So, in a moment of rage and confusion, he had killed the man who had been everything to him. A part of him had tried to justify it. Isaac had pushed him too far. Isaac had been the one to force him into a corner. But deep down, Matthew knew that it had been his choice. He had made that decision. And now Isaac was dead. The guilt gnawed at him. It wasn't just about killing Isaac. It was about everything they had shared, everything Matthew had never been brave enough to embrace. All those years of hiding, of lying to everyone around him, and now everything was gone. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see a police officer standing behind him, a grim expression on his face. "Matthew Williams?" the officer asked. Matthew's throat tightened. Yes, I'm Matthew. We need to talk to you about the death of Isaac Thompson. You're being taken into custody for questioning. Matthew's heart dropped into his stomach. His secret, his crime, it was no longer his to control. The world would know. The officers would take him, and his father, Pastor John Williams, would never look at him the same way again. But there was no escaping it. He couldn't undo what had been done. As the officer approached, Matthew glanced once more at the wilderness stretching out before him. The world beyond these mountains, beyond this cabin, would never be the same for him. Nothing would ever be the same. The officer cuffed him, and with each step toward the waiting car, Matthew felt the weight of his actions sink deeper into his bones. His honeymoon had ended in death, and he had no idea how he would ever face the people he loved again. The people who would now learn what kind of person he really was. The Williams family home, nestled on a quiet street in the heart of Marion, Alabama, stood as a symbol of stability, reverence, and community. It was a well-kept, traditional house with a white picket fence, manicured lawns, and a porch where neighbors could be seen stopping by for a friendly chat. Pastor John Williams had spent years building a reputation in this small town, known for his unwavering faith, his comforting sermons, and his dedication to his church and family. He was the embodiment of righteousness. He was the rock upon which the community leaned. Clara, his wife, sat at the dining table as she did most mornings, reading through a collection of scripture and preparing breakfast. Her soft smile was an extension of the kindness she had shown to every person who walked through their church doors. She had raised her two children, Matthew and his younger sister Lily, with love and discipline, instilling in them the values of humility, faith, and respect. Yet, despite her devotion to the Lord and to her family, there was always an underlying anxiety that gnawed at her. In recent months, it was as though a shadow had been cast over their home, a weight that neither she nor John could quite explain. Matthew, her oldest child, had become more distant. It was subtle at first, a late arrival to family dinners, a reluctance to engage in conversations, a coldness in his voice. But Clara had brushed it off. He was, after all, a young man coming into his own. He was finding his place in the world, navigating adulthood as every child must. But deep down, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She had often caught John's gaze flickering to Matthew with a look of quiet concern. John, the ever-optimistic and steadfast man of the house, had always believed that his faith would shield his family from any harm. But as the days wore on and Matthew seemed to withdraw further, John couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that maybe he had missed something vital. The perfect image he had built for his family seemed to be cracking ever so slightly, though he refused to acknowledge it aloud. As Clara set the breakfast table that morning, the phone rang, shattering the usual calm of their routine. She rushed to pick it up, knowing it could be a call from the church or a fellow parishioner asking for advice or assistance. But what she heard on the other end made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Williams," a steady, somber voice spoke, "this is Officer Reynolds from the Marion Police Department. We need to speak with you and your husband as soon as possible. It concerns your son Matthew." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What about Matthew?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid he's involved in a situation. We need you to come to the station. It's urgent." The line went silent. Clara felt the weight of those few words crashing down on her. Something was wrong. It was as though the ground beneath her had given way. She felt her knees buckle and stumbled back into the chair, her hand gripping the edge of the table for support. "Clara? What is it?" John's voice came from the hallway, his brow furrowed in concern. Clara tried to steady herself, but her hand trembled as she held the receiver to her ear. "They said they need us at the police station." "It's Matthew. Something's happened," Clara whispered, barely able to get the words out. John's face turned pale as he crossed the room quickly, his own sense of dread mounting with each passing second. Clara's hands shook as she hung up the phone, and they both stood there in stunned silence. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. They both had their suspicions. Matthew had been acting strangely lately, but this was something far more serious. "Come on, Clara," John said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to go. We need to figure this out." The drive to the police station was a blur of disconnected thoughts, questions, and fear. John tried to remain calm, but the tension in the car was suffocating. Clara's mind raced. What had Matthew done? Was he in trouble? Had something happened to him? They arrived at the station, and the cold, sterile walls of the building seemed to magnify the fear and confusion that gripped them both. A uniformed officer met them at the door, his face unreadable as he led them to a small, windowless room. Inside, Officer Reynolds was waiting for them. His expression was grave as he stood up from his chair, motioning for them to sit down. "I'm sorry to have to bring you in under such circumstances," Officer Reynolds began, his voice steady but laced with concern. "There's been an incident involving your son Matthew." Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. "What happened? Where is he? Is he okay?" "Your son is in custody," Officer Reynolds continued, his eyes locking with theirs. "We've got him for questioning about a murder. His partner, Isaac Thompson, is dead. We believe Matthew was involved in the incident." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. A murder? Her mind went blank for a moment. She couldn't process what he was saying. She looked to John, whose face had gone ashen. "Murder?" John repeated, his voice hoarse. "What are you talking about? Matthew didn't do anything like that. This can't be true." "I'm afraid it is," Officer Reynolds said, his voice firm but compassionate. "We're still investigating the circumstances, but everything points to your son. He and Isaac Thompson were in a relationship, and there seems to have been a violent confrontation. Isaac is dead and Matthew was found at the scene." Clara gasped, her hands trembling. No, this isn't right. Matthew would never." She couldn't finish the sentence. John stood up, pacing the small room. "There must be some kind of mistake. My son, he's a good man. He was raised in the church. He would never hurt anyone." But as John spoke, Clara could feel the cold, hard truth settling in. The perfect life they had built was crumbling. The child she had raised, the son she had trusted with everything, was now implicated in a crime she couldn't even begin to understand. How could this happen? How could it be their son? The officer continued to explain the details, but Clara's mind was elsewhere. She could hardly hear him. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart, the hollow feeling in her chest. They left the station later that afternoon, their heads spinning with the shock of what they had just learned. As they drove back to their home, the weight of the revelation pressed down on them both. Clara's thoughts were a jumble of confusion, anger, disbelief, and fear. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run to Matthew and ask him why. Why had he done this? Why had he kept this secret from her? John, ever the stoic figure, remained silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The once vibrant family they had been was now a shadow, torn apart by secrets and lies. The following days were a blur of lawyers, interviews, and a constant stream of visitors from the church, all eager to offer their support. Though Clara and John knew the truth, there was no real support to be found. How could they continue to live the lives they had so carefully crafted when their own son was at the center of a murder investigation? How could they face their congregation, their friends, when they knew their son had done something unthinkable? As the days passed, the reality of what had happened slowly began to settle in. Clara's heart ached for Isaac's family, for the life that had been taken so violently. But it ached equally for her own family, for the son she had tried to raise in faith, who had now thrown everything away in an instant. The once strong foundation of the Williams family had begun to crack, and Clara knew deep down that it would never be the same. The morning after the horrifying events, the sun rose like any other, casting long shadows over the quiet town of Marion. But for the Williams family, this morning was unlike any other. The small, peaceful town had been rocked by news of a crime so shocking, it felt impossible to believe. Isaac Thompson was dead, and the police had Matthew Williams, the golden boy, the pastor's son, as the prime suspect. Matthew stood in the middle of the luxurious cabin, the once charming honeymoon suite now a scene of violence. His mind was blank, disoriented from the rage and guilt that had consumed him the night before. The cabin, which had been meant to be a symbol of a fresh start, a place where Matthew and Isaac could escape the eyes of the world, was now a grim reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. The air in the cabin was still, heavy with the silence of death. The scent of spilled wine, mixed with the faint traces of blood, clung to the space. The floor was covered with overturned furniture, and shards of broken glass lay scattered across the room, as though time had been shattered. Isaac's blood was everywhere, on the wooden floorboards, on the broken railing, and on the bed where Matthew had last seen him alive. Matthew had never intended to kill Isaac. That had never been the plan. But the pressure, the fear, had overwhelmed him. He had been terrified, scared of losing everything, and when Isaac pushed him to confront their future, Matthew cracked. The confession Isaac had demanded had become too much to bear. In his rage, he had lost control, and the man he had once loved was now lying lifeless on the ground. When the police arrived at the cabin, Matthew was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring into space, almost as if he had shut the world out entirely. He didn't know what to do or say. It was as if his entire reality had collapsed around him, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. The first officer who entered the cabin was calm but firm. Detective Susan Hayes was a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense attitude, known for her sharp instincts and thorough work. She looked at Matthew with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. She had seen cases like this before, families torn apart, lives shattered in an instant, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional weight that seemed to radiate from the scene before her. This wasn't just another crime, this was personal. Matthew Williams? Detective Hayes asked gently but with authority. Matthew nodded slowly, barely lifting his head. His voice when he spoke was barely a whisper. Yes, I'm Matthew. We need to talk about Isaac Thompson, she continued, her voice steady, though her eyes were sharp. Can you tell me what happened here last night? Matthew's chest tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. What could he say? What could he possibly say to explain what had happened? He couldn't even explain it to himself. I don't know what happened, he finally said, his voice shaking. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for it to go that far. Detective Hayes glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the blood-stained floor, the broken furniture, and the obvious signs of struggle. There was no denying the violence that had taken place. She knew this wasn't an accident. She knew Matthew had been involved. The question now was whether he had killed Isaac out of passion or out of something darker. We're going to need you to come with us, Hayes said. We're taking you to the station for questioning. Matthew didn't resist. There was no point. He knew the truth. He knew what he had done. And he knew that his life, the life he had so carefully constructed, was over. The drive to the police station was agonizingly silent. Matthew sat in the back of the squad car, staring out the window at the passing landscape, but his mind was elsewhere. It was like he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. He could still hear Isaac's voice in his head, asking him to be honest, to stop hiding. And in that moment, Matthew had wanted to be free of the lies. He had wanted to be free of everything, except he didn't know that freedom would come at such a high cost. At the station, the detectives began their questioning. Detective Hayes was professional, calm, but she didn't sugarcoat the severity of the situation. Matthew was no longer the young man from the church who had sat quietly in the pews, who had volunteered at every opportunity. He was a suspect in a murder case, and the evidence was already stacking up against him. Matthew, Hayes began, her voice gentle but direct, we've found Isaac's body. He was severely beaten. We know you two were in a relationship. What we don't know is what caused this violence. Tell us what happened. The words tumbled out of Matthew's mouth, almost as though he couldn't stop himself. He explained the argument, Isaac's plea for them to be open, his demand that Matthew confront the truth about their relationship. And then when Isaac wouldn't let it go, when he kept pushing and pushing, Matthew snapped. The rage he had been holding inside, the fear of being exposed, had taken control. I didn't want to hurt him, Matthew said, his voice barely audible. I loved him. I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to live with the truth. Detective Hayes didn't interrupt. She let him speak, letting the weight of his words sink in. It was clear Matthew was remorseful, but that didn't change the fact that Isaac was dead. That didn't change the brutal reality of what had happened. We're going to need more than this, Matthew, Hayes said quietly. Your story doesn't add up. The evidence we found points to something more than just a moment of rage. There's something you're not telling us. Matthew looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. He knew what she meant. She suspected he had killed Isaac in cold blood, not just in a fit of passion. The physical evidence, the way Isaac had been struck repeatedly, the way his body had been left in such a brutal position, spoke to a level of violence that went beyond a moment of rage. I didn't mean to kill him, Matthew repeated, his voice shaking. I swear I didn't. It was just, everything, it was too much. Detective Hayes leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to study Matthew. She knew there was more to the story, but he wasn't ready to admit it. It was clear that his emotions were raw, that he was struggling with what he had done, but it would take more than a confession to piece together the full truth. As the hours passed and Matthew continued to speak, his words became more disjointed, more fragmented. It was as though he was reliving the events over and over again in his mind, trying to make sense of a nightmare that was too real to escape. But no matter how much he spoke, no matter how many times he apologized, the fact remained. Isaac was dead. And there was no going back. The story that Matthew told that night wasn't the full truth. He hadn't told them everything. And as the night wore on, the realization set in that the truth of what had happened between him and Isaac was something much darker than anyone had anticipated. The truth would come out eventually, But for now, Matthew was left to confront the consequences of his actions, knowing that no amount of regret would bring Isaac back. As Detective Hayes closed her notebook and stood up to leave, Matthew sat in silence, his mind numb. He could hear the distant sounds of the station outside the interrogation room, but it all felt so far away. He was alone in his thoughts, alone with the weight of what he had done. The world as he had known it was gone. And there was no escape. The days following Matthew's arrest were marked by a grim silence in the Williams household. The usually bustling town of Marion, with its quiet streets and tight-knit community, seemed to hold its breath as it awaited the next move in the investigation. The police, led by Detective Hayes, had already begun gathering evidence, and it was clear from the start that this was no simple case. There were still so many unanswered questions, and the truth behind Isaac's death would not come easily. At the station, the investigation into Matthew's involvement in Isaac's death unfolded with methodical precision. Detective Hayes had worked with many cases before, but the depth of this one felt personal. She couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for Isaac's family, but she also couldn't let that cloud her judgment. The facts had to speak for themselves, and right now they pointed in one direction. The morning after Matthew's questioning, the team of investigators sifted through the crime scene with a fine-tooth comb. The cabin where the murder had occurred was still in disarray, furniture overturned, shattered glass, and splattered blood decorating the room. The evidence suggested a violent altercation, but there was something else too, something that didn't quite add up. The physical evidence suggested that Isaac had been struck multiple times with a heavy object, likely the metal sculpture found nearby. The brutality of the act indicated that Matthew had been in a state of intense rage, but there were no signs of a struggle beforehand. It didn't match the typical pattern of a violent outburst. Something was off. The detectives were beginning to piece together a theory, but there were still many loose ends. Back in Marion, as the police worked, the community was left to grapple with the aftermath. Clara and John Williams found themselves at the center of a storm they never could have anticipated. The church, once a sanctuary of faith and comfort, had become the epicenter of gossip and speculation. Church members, friends, and even extended family had begun asking questions. Whispers that were both cruel and kind-hearted in their attempt to understand what had happened. Pastor John, ever the pillar of strength, had tried to hold his family together, but it wasn't easy. The news of Matthew's involvement in Isaac's murder had sent shockwaves through the congregation. How could the pastor's son, a young man raised in the church, known for his good deeds and kind heart, be capable of such violence? The very thought seemed unfathomable to many. Still, there was more at play here than just Matthew's actions. The police had begun to dig into the nature of his relationship with Isaac, and what they discovered caused even more tension within the Williams family. Matthew's hidden life, the love he had shared with Isaac, had been a secret not just from the town but from his own family. Clara had always suspected that Matthew was hiding something. There had been moments, quiet moments late at night when she'd catch him staring out the window, his face etched with an emotion she couldn't quite place. And there were the subtle signs, the cryptic messages on his phone, the hurried exits when family gatherings grew too long. But Clara had never pressed him. She had trusted him, believed that whatever it was, Matthew would come to her when he was ready. Now, Clara's heart was breaking for a different reason. She couldn't reconcile the son she knew with the man who was implicated in such a brutal crime. She had raised him to be compassionate, to show empathy and kindness to others. How could this have happened? How could the man she had nurtured, the boy she had prayed for every night, be capable of such an atrocity? In the days that followed, Detective Hayes' team began interviewing everyone connected to Matthew and Isaac. They spoke to friends, family, co-workers, and anyone who had known the couple, hoping to find any clue that would explain the motive behind the murder. They soon learned more about Isaac's background and his relationship with Matthew. Isaac had come from a broken family. Raised in a home full of conflict and neglect, he had often found solace in the church, drawn to its sense of community and belonging. But as he got older, Isaac's need for acceptance grew, and he had started a relationship with Matthew, a man who seemed as though he could give him the love and attention he had been seeking for so long. The detectives uncovered an old journal that Isaac had kept during his time in high school. It was filled with musings on his struggles, his desires, and his longing to be loved. The journal hinted at a deep connection between Isaac and Matthew, though it also painted a picture of a young man torn between his love for Matthew and the fear of rejection. Isaac had written about the pressure of hiding their relationship, of living in fear of what others would say. There were clues in the journal that suggested Isaac had been ready to take their relationship public, but it was also clear that this would have been a dangerous move in such a conservative town. Marion had always been a place where traditions were upheld, and anything that deviated from the norm was met with disapproval. Isaac had known that revealing the truth would have been a risk, not only to his relationship with Matthew but to their safety in the community. As the investigation continued, the more the police uncovered, the more they began to realize that Matthew wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Isaac, too, had been living a life of quiet defiance, concealing the depth of his relationship with Matthew from his own family and friends. But his motives for wanting to go public were different. He wanted to be free from the chains of secrecy. He wanted to live his truth, to stop hiding who he was. But Matthew, driven by his fear of rejection and the pressure of living up to his father's expectations, had been unable to handle the weight of it all. The police believed that, in the heat of the moment when Isaac had pushed him too far, Matthew had acted out of a deep sense of desperation. His emotions, fueled by guilt and fear, had taken control. Detective Hayes was aware that the full truth was still far from being revealed. Matthew's confession had been partial. He had admitted to killing Isaac, but his reasons remained murky. Was it a crime of passion, an impulsive act of rage, or was there more to it? Was Matthew hiding something else, something darker, about his relationship with Isaac? The more they uncovered about the emotional turmoil both Matthew and Isaac had been experiencing, the more the detectives began to understand the complexities of the situation. This wasn't just a murder, it was a tragedy, a culmination of years of pressure, secrecy, and unspoken desires. The investigation continued for weeks, with evidence piling up but still no clear motive. Matthew had been seen as a beloved figure in Marion, the son of a man who was seen as a moral authority. But as the case progressed, the town's perception of him was starting to shift. People who had once praised him for his character now wondered if they had been wrong all along. The community was split between those who stood by the Williams family and those who felt betrayed by Matthew's actions. Pastor John, in particular, was struggling with the reality of what was happening. The weight of the scandal was slowly crushing him. His son was a murderer, and the truth could not be hidden. He had spent his entire life preaching about love, forgiveness, and redemption, but now he had to reconcile those teachings with the reality of his own family's tragedy. The lines between faith and betrayal were growing blurred, and John didn't know how to navigate them. As the investigation moved forward, the entire Williams family found themselves caught in a web of secrecy, guilt, and heartbreak. Matthew's crime had not only shattered Isaac's life, it had torn apart the fabric of everything the Williams family had built. And as Detective Hayes continued to unravel the layers of lies and emotions that had led to the tragic death, it became clear that the path to justice would not be easy for anyone involved. The news of Matthew Williams's involvement in Isaac Thompson's murder spread through Marion like wildfire, igniting a wave of emotions that rippled through the community. Marion had always prided itself on its small-town charm, where everyone knew everyone, and personal affairs were often seen through the lens of gossip and community gossip. But nothing could prepare the town for the tragedy that had struck at the very heart of its moral foundation. A pastor's son involved in a brutal crime? It was unthinkable, and yet it was real. For Pastor John and Clara Williams, the shock of the murder reverberated in every corner of their lives. Their home, once filled with the sounds of quiet prayers and warm conversations, was now haunted by the weight of their son's actions. They had spent years fostering a reputation of piety, respect, and dignity. Matthew had always been a model son, a bright young man who helped lead the youth group and volunteered at church events. He was the perfect child, the child every parent in Marion wished they could raise. How could such a person, so outwardly good, be capable of such violence? The townspeople had a difficult time reconciling the image of Matthew they had known with the young man now arrested for murder. At first, the reaction was one of disbelief. Some simply couldn't accept that Matthew had killed Isaac. He was the son of the respected Pastor John, after all. Surely this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Perhaps Isaac had provoked Matthew, they reasoned, pushing him to act in a moment of weakness. Others wondered if there had been a misunderstanding of some kind, an accident gone horribly wrong. But even as they searched for a reason to absolve Matthew, there were whispers of doubt. At the local diner, where residents gathered over coffee each morning, the conversation inevitably turned to the tragedy. The gossip spread quickly, each person adding their own spin to the story. "You heard what happened, right?" one woman whispered to her friend as she sipped her coffee. "I can't believe it. I've known that boy since he was a baby. He was always so polite, so good-hearted. This doesn't make sense." "I've been thinking about it," another woman chimed in, her voice tinged with skepticism. "He always seemed a little too perfect, you know? Always so eager to please his dad. Maybe there was more to it than we saw." Maybe he wasn't as innocent as we thought. The discussions were heated and opinions were divided. Some were quick to defend Matthew, eager to believe that he was just a victim of circumstance. After all, he had grown up in the church, had been surrounded by faith his entire life. Surely he couldn't have just snapped. Others, though, couldn't let go of the suspicion that something darker was at play. Some town residents began to question how Matthew had managed to hide such a crucial part of his life, the relationship with Isaac, from his family and the entire town for so long. What else had Matthew been hiding? Was this just the tip of the iceberg? As the days passed, the tension in Marion only grew. The town was divided between those who believed in Matthew's innocence and those who demanded justice for Isaac. For some, it was a matter of faith. Could they continue to support a man of the cloth whose own son had committed such a heinous crime? For others, it was a question of morality. Could they forgive Matthew for what he had done? Or was the betrayal of trust too much to overcome? At the church, Pastor John found himself at the center of a storm. His congregation, once loyal and unwavering, began to turn on him. His Sunday sermons, once filled with hope and love, became heavy with the weight of the unspoken questions in the air. The community that had once supported him now seemed unsure of their place in his life, and some members even stopped attending services altogether. They couldn't face the reality that the man they had looked up to, the man who had helped guide their spiritual lives, had raised a son who had killed another human being. It was clear that this scandal was not only a personal tragedy for the Williams family but also a deep moral crisis for the community. As much as Pastor John tried to maintain his composure, the strain was evident. He found it difficult to address his congregation, knowing that his every word would be scrutinized. He had spent his life teaching the principles of forgiveness and redemption, but now he wasn't sure how to apply those teachings to his own son. Could he forgive Matthew? Could he show compassion and love, even in the face of such betrayal? Or would his son's actions forever alter their relationship? Clara, meanwhile, was struggling in her own way. She had always seen herself as a protector, a mother who shielded her children from the harshness of the world. But now she felt as though the very foundation of her life was crumbling. How could she reconcile the boy she had raised, the child she had loved, with the man who had taken Isaac's life? She couldn't stop thinking about Isaac's family, the grief they must have been experiencing. Clara's heart ached for them even as it broke for her own son. Despite the turmoil, Clara tried to maintain her composure for the sake of her younger daughter Lily. Lily had always been close to Matthew, the two of them sharing a bond that seemed unbreakable. But now Lily had withdrawn into herself. She barely spoke and refused to leave her room. The entire family was consumed by the same questions. Why had this happened? What had led Matthew to commit such an unthinkable act? In the midst of the storm, there was one group in town who remained unwavering in their support of Matthew: his friends from church. Many of the youth group members who had known him for years began to rally behind him. They posted messages of encouragement on social media, expressing their belief in Matthew's goodness, their faith that he could be forgiven, and their hope that the truth would come out in time. "We know Matthew. We know he's not a killer," one of his friends posted on Facebook. "We stand by him and we'll pray for him and for Isaac's family. This isn't over." Despite the support from some corners of the community, there was an undercurrent of tension that couldn't be ignored. Many people in Marion were uncomfortable with the idea that Matthew, a young man they had once trusted, could have been hiding such a dark secret for so long. Some questioned the integrity of Pastor John's leadership, wondering if he had failed to notice the signs that something was wrong with his son. Others, however, held fast to their belief that Matthew had simply been caught in a web of confusion and fear, that his crime was the result of a deep internal struggle. At the same time, the town's reaction to Isaac's death was equally divided. Isaac's family had long been estranged from him, and there were few people in town who had known him well. But in the days following the murder, those who had once dismissed Isaac began to see him in a new light. They mourned his life, but they also mourned the fact that they had failed to acknowledge him for who he truly was: a man who had sought love and acceptance, a man who had been forced to hide his true self from the world. Some in town began to wonder, had Isaac's death been the result of his own desperation, his desire to be loved, or had he simply been caught in the crossfire of a society that refused to accept him for who he was? As the trial drew nearer, the entire town seemed to be holding its breath. Some hoped that Matthew would be cleared of all charges, that the truth would be revealed and everything would go back to normal. Others, however, believed that the scales of justice had already tipped, and that Matthew's actions, regardless of the circumstances, could never be forgiven. The town of Marion was forever changed by the events that had unfolded. What had once been a peaceful, quiet community was now torn apart by tragedy, secrets, and moral questions. No one could say for sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: the Williams family and the town itself would never be the same. The day of the trial finally arrived, and Marion was gripped by a palpable sense of tension. The courthouse, which had always served as a place of justice and resolution, now felt like a battleground. The town had been torn apart by the events that had transpired in the past few weeks. For many, the trial was not just a legal matter. It was the moment that would determine how their faith, their values, and their community would move forward. Matthew's defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer from out of town named Samuel Thomas, had been working tirelessly to prepare for the trial. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with authority and conviction. He believed in his client's innocence, or at least in mitigating circumstances, and he was determined to present a case that would cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. Clara and John Williams sat in the front row of the courtroom, their faces drawn and weary. They had been through so much, and the weight of the situation had taken its toll. John had always believed that his role as a father and a pastor was to guide his children on the right path, but now, as he sat beside Clara, he realized that nothing could have prepared him for the nightmare they were living. Matthew, who had once been a bright, optimistic young man, now appeared withdrawn. His once perfect appearance was marred by the strain of the trial and the guilt that weighed heavily on his heart. His eyes were vacant, as if he had retreated into himself, unable to face the consequences of his actions. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Matthew was not the same person who had walked into the cabin just a few weeks earlier. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rachel Harmon, had a strong case. They had gathered evidence that pointed to Matthew as the sole perpetrator of Isaac's death. The bloodstains in the cabin, the violent nature of the attack, and the testimony of the police officers who had found Matthew at the scene, all of it pointed to one conclusion: Matthew had killed Isaac in cold blood. But as the trial progressed, something unexpected happened. The prosecution's case began to unravel, piece by piece. Detective Hayes, who had led the investigation, was called to the stand. She described the scene in the cabin, the brutality of the crime, and the evidence they had collected. But as she spoke, there was an underlying sense of hesitation in her voice, as though she was holding back something. "I'm not sure we have the full picture," she said quietly during cross-examination. "There are still a lot of unanswered questions." This statement, although subtle, sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. The defense lawyer, Samuel Thomas, jumped at the opportunity to exploit the doubt that was beginning to form. He began to push Detective Hayes harder, asking her about the inconsistencies in the evidence, the lack of direct eyewitness testimony, and the absence of a clear motive. As the defense pressed on, they began to highlight a new angle, a potential twist in the case that no one had considered before. It was a subtle shift, a flicker of hope for Matthew and his family. Thomas suggested that Isaac's death might not have been a simple act of violence, but rather a tragic accident that spiraled out of control. What if Isaac had provoked Matthew into a situation he couldn't control? Thomas suggested during his argument. What if Isaac's actions in that cabin, his insistence on forcing Matthew to confront their relationship, pushed him too far? Was it truly a murder, or was it the result of a heated argument that escalated into something neither of them could stop? The defense presented a theory that began to gain traction. Isaac's desperation to reveal the truth, his pressure on Matthew to come out, had driven the confrontation to a breaking point. But was it premeditated? Had Matthew deliberately set out to kill Isaac, or had it been a momentary lapse in judgment, an outburst fueled by emotions too powerful for him to control? The twist didn't stop there. The defense introduced new evidence: text messages between Isaac and Matthew in the days leading up to the murder. The messages revealed that Isaac had been pushing Matthew to come clean, to stop hiding their relationship. But there was something else in those messages, something that struck a chord with the jury. Isaac had expressed fear in some of the texts. He had written, "I don't know if we can keep this a secret any longer, but I'm scared. Scared for us, scared for me. What if someone finds out?" This revelation hit the courtroom hard. Isaac had been afraid of the consequences, and it was becoming clear that his fear had been a driving force behind the confrontation. Was Isaac's death truly the result of a sudden violent outburst from Matthew? Or had Isaac's own fear of exposure, his own sense of desperation, played a role in pushing the situation to its tragic conclusion? As the defense continued to build its case, the prosecution's confidence began to waver. They had focused so heavily on portraying Matthew as a cold-blooded killer, but now there was doubt. There was a growing sense that the case was not as clear-cut as they had initially thought. The more they questioned the evidence, the more holes began to appear in their narrative. Was Matthew guilty of murder, or was he simply a young man caught in a web of emotion and fear? The courtroom was on edge as the defense made its closing argument. Samuel Thomas spoke with passion, his voice steady and persuasive. He painted a picture of a young man who had been trapped by his circumstances, caught between his love for Isaac and the crushing weight of his family's expectations. He argued that Matthew had not intended to kill Isaac, but had been overwhelmed by a rush of emotions, fear, and guilt that led to a tragic outcome. The question before you is not whether Matthew loved Isaac, Thomas said, looking directly at the jury. It's whether he deliberately took Isaac's life or if, in a moment of weakness, he made a horrible mistake, one that he will regret for the rest of his life. The closing arguments were followed by a tense period of deliberation. The jury was torn. Some believed that Matthew had acted out of a sudden, uncontrollable rage, while others were convinced that he had been driven to his breaking point by Isaac's persistent pressure. It was a case of emotions gone awry, a momentary lapse in judgment that resulted in irreversible tragedy. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for the decision that would determine Matthew's fate. Guilty of manslaughter, the foreman announced, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in relief. Matthew was not guilty of murder, but the verdict still carried a significant sentence. He had taken Isaac's life, but the jury had determined that it had not been premeditated. The charge of manslaughter reflected the tragic, emotional nature of the crime. As Matthew was led away in handcuffs, his family sat in stunned silence. They had hoped for a lighter sentence, for an acquittal, but the reality was now clear. Matthew had committed a crime, but it wasn't the cold-blooded murder that the prosecution had argued. For the Williams family, the trial was over, but the scars of what had happened would remain forever. Marion, too, had been forever changed. The town would never forget the tragedy that had torn apart a beloved family, and the question of forgiveness would linger long after the courtroom doors had closed. But as Matthew was taken away, there was one final twist that no one had expected. In a private moment after the trial, Detective Hayes approached the Williams family. She had been quietly investigating something else, something that hadn't been revealed during the trial. And as she spoke with Clara and John, she hinted that there was still much more to this story than anyone realized. Justice may have been served in this case, Detective Hayes said, her voice grave. But there are still questions about Isaac's past, about his relationship with other people. There may be more to this story than we thought. That was a bombshell no one had anticipated. The Williams family was left to wonder what secrets Isaac had kept hidden, and whether they would ever truly understand the full scope of what had led to his death. The twist, though unexpected, was the final reminder that even when justice is served, there are always more layers to a story, more truths left untold.